$0. That is what Owen Greer paid for the first delivery of spent grain and mash from the Kellner Valley Mill in the spring of 1988. The same week, the Kellner Valley Mill's waste disposal contractor had been charging them $47 a ton to haul the same material away. And the same week, every farmer within 20 miles who heard about the arrangement made some version of the same comment, which was that Owen Greer had finally figured out how to turn garbage into feed, and that the only question was whether the pigs would be smarter about it than he was. 4 or 5 years after that first delivery, the joke stayed roughly the same, while the math kept changing quietly in Owen's favor. And by the autumn of 1993, when the first batch of pigs raised entirely on the mill's waste stream went through the regional livestock auction, the price per pound those animals commanded was high enough that the auctioneer called out the number twice. And the room went quiet in a specific way that rooms go quiet when the number everyone expected has been replaced by a number nobody budgeted for. The man who had been making most of the jokes for 5 years was the same man who had been selling his own pigs through the same auction at the same commodity price as every other conventional operation in the region, and who sat in the auction barn that day watching Owen Greer's animals clear the floor at a premium that nobody in the room had known was achievable in Kellner Valley. Dean Ferris had run the largest hog operation in the county for 22 years, served on the Regional Pork Producers Association board that set the standard feeding and management protocols most operations in the valley used as their baseline, and had spent 5 years treating Owen Greer's waste-fed operation as the kind of story that made a good cautionary tale about shortcuts and a better punchline at producer meetings. He had never, in 5 years of dismissing it, run the actual numbers on what the Kellner Valley Mill's spent grain was doing to the fat composition and flavor profile of the animals eating it, because the animals eating it were, in his assessment, the kind of animals whose numbers you didn't need to run because the conclusion was obvious. By November of 1993, the conclusion was not obvious, and Dean Ferris was the person most visibly sitting with that fact in a barn full of people who had all made some version of his assumption and were now looking at the auction board with expressions that suggested a rethink was coming whether they wanted it or not. None of that had happened yet on the cold spring morning in 1988 when Owen Greer shook hands with the Kellner Valley Mill's operations manager and agreed to take 30 tons of spent grain and mash off the mill's hands every week, driving home in a truck that smelled like fermentation and feeling for the first time in 2 years of trying to keep a small pig operation solvent. Like the math might finally be about to work in his direction. To understand how 5 years of feeding pigs mill waste that nobody else wanted produced animals that nobody in the regional market had seen priced like that before, you have to start with what the mill was throwing away, and with why it was worth considerably more than nothing. Kellner Valley sat in a stretch of grain processing country where the dominant economic fact of life was the Kellner Valley Mill, a flour and specialty grain processing facility that had operated for 40 years and that produced, as an unavoidable byproduct of its milling operation, somewhere between 250 and 300 tons per week of spent grain, bran, germ, and fermentation mash that the mill had been paying its waste disposal contractor to remove since the early 1970s, when environmental regulations had made direct land disposal impractical. The mill's operations manager, a man named Carl Dunn who had been running the facility's day-to-day production for 16 years, had spent most of those 16 years treating the waste disposal line item as simply a cost of doing business, $47 a ton, week in and week out, a number that had been rising with inflation and that nobody at the mill had ever seriously questioned because it was not the kind of number the mill's ownership paid attention to when the facility was running profitably. Dean Ferris had been approached about the mill waste years before Owen had, by Carl Dunn himself, who had read somewhere that spent grain had a history as animal feed and thought it might be worth asking one of the valley's larger hog producers whether they'd be interested. Dean had turned him down without much deliberation, citing the inconsistency of the waste stream's composition and the fact that his operation ran on a certified feeding protocol required by the Pork Association's premium certification program, a protocol that did not accommodate waste stream inputs of variable composition and that he was not willing to risk his certification to experiment with. He had not mentioned to Carl that the premium certification's actual premium, measured against open market prices, had been declining for several years, and that the certification's value was considerably less clear than it had been when he'd first enrolled. Owen Greer had been farming 60 acres on the valley's eastern edge for 7 years, a small diversified operation he had inherited partly from his father and partly from a bought-in parcel that had stretched his finances thin enough that he'd been looking for a cost reduction anywhere he could find one since before the mill waste idea had ever occurred to him. He'd heard about Carl Dunn's offer to Dean through the kind of word-of-mouth transmission that moves through a rural valley faster than most people credit. And he'd called Carl the following morning, not with a plan fully formed, but with the beginning of arithmetic he was fairly sure would work if the material was what Dunn said it was. It was. And the arithmetic worked better than he'd estimated, because the element he hadn't fully accounted for was not the feeding cost reduction, but something else the mill's waste stream was doing to his animals that he only began to understand clearly after the first full batch had gone through the auction and a livestock nutritionist from the Regional Agricultural College had driven out to find out why. Bert Colby had been raising hogs on the property adjacent to Owens for 11 years, a conventional operation that ran on the same certified feeding protocol as Dean Ferris's and that produced reliable, if undistinguished results in the regional market. And he was the first person to say out loud what most of the valley was privately thinking when Owens signed the waste agreement with the mill. "You know what you're going to end up with," Bert said, leaning on the fence between their properties with a coffee cup that had been there since 8 in the morning. "Pigs that smell like the inside of a brewery and taste like whatever's in that mash this week. You can't run a consistent operation on material that changes composition every time the mill switches what it's processing." Owen told him the composition didn't change as much as Bert was assuming, that the mill's core waste stream was relatively consistent week to week because its core production run was relatively consistent, and that the variation was within ranges he'd worked out with Carl Dunn over 2 months of conversations before signing anything. Bert shook his head. "Dean's going to say the same thing I'm saying, and Dean's been doing this longer than both of us combined," he said, and left it there. The way people leave things there when they believe they've made their point and prefer not to have to defend it any further. The Pork Association meeting that fall was the first public airing of what was happening at Owen's operation, brought up not by Owen, but by someone who had been at the mill when a delivery truck from Owen's farm had shown up for the weekly waste pickup and who mentioned it in the context of a general conversation about unconventional feeding practices. Dean Ferris said, across the meeting room, that he'd heard about it and that he'd been approached about the same material years earlier and hadn't seen the value in it, which was close enough to a public dismissal that the room took it as one. Owen, who was at the meeting because he was a dues-paying member of the association, said nothing, which most people in the room probably interpreted as acceptance of the assessment rather than what it actually was, which was a decision to let the animals make the argument when they were ready. Carol Estep had been the livestock nutrition extension agent for the Regional Agricultural College's county program for 9 years when she stopped at Owen's operation on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd year, not at his invitation, but because she had been asked by a colleague to check on an operation whose waste feeding arrangement had come up at a regional animal science conference as a potential case study. She spent 2 hours walking the pens before she said much, examining the animals at different growth stages, asking Owen about feed volumes and schedule and the composition ranges Carl Dunn had provided him, and then sitting in the farm office with the records Owen had been keeping since the first delivery. "I want to ask you something before I tell you what I'm seeing," she said. "How much do you know about intramuscular fat development and the role of dietary fat profile in that process?" Owen told her he knew it had to do with marbling and that he knew marbling affected price, but that he'd always understood it as something that happened through genetics and growth rate management rather than feed composition specifically. Carol told him that was the standard understanding in commercial pork production and that it was also, by current research standards, incomplete in a specific and commercially significant way. The spent grain and mash from a flour mill of this type is high in complex carbohydrates, B vitamins, and trace minerals that are present in the outer bran and germ of the grain and that are largely absent from standard commercial hog rations because they're milled out before the ration ingredients are processed, she said. Those compounds, delivered at the volumes you're running, are doing something to the intramuscular fat development in these animals that I have not seen documented at this level in a waste-fed system before. The marbling scores I'm estimating from what I'm seeing in your pen would, if they hold through to slaughter, put these animals in a price category that standard commodity pork production in this valley has not been reaching." She set her clipboard down. "How long has it been since you had an animal go through the auction?" He told her he hadn't run a batch yet, that the first full cohort was about 18 months out. She asked if she could come back for the auction. He said she was welcome to. Owen did not share Carol Estep's assessment with anyone in the valley between her visit and the 1993 auction, continuing to collect his mill waste deliveries on the same schedule, keep his records in the same notebook, and present, to anyone who drove past or asked, exactly the same unremarkable picture of a small operation feeding its animals on material nobody else wanted. The Pork Association meetings he continued to attend through that period were occasionally entertaining in the specific way that sitting on information nobody else has access to tends to make meetings entertaining, particularly when the topic of waste-fed operations came up, as it did twice more in 2 years. Each time with Dean Ferris's dismissal serving as the room's efficient shortcut past the point where the question might have deserved a longer answer. Carl Dunn from the mill called Owen every week, because Carl had been calling every week since the first delivery, and the calls had evolved from operational logistics in the first year to something more like an ongoing conversation between two people who had each gotten considerably more than they expected from an arrangement that neither of them had expected very much from. Carl had run the numbers on the mill's waste disposal costs after Owen's first full year of pickups and had found that the weekly $47 a ton disposal cost, multiplied by 30 tons, multiplied by 52 weeks, came to just over $73,000 a year that the mill had been paying to get rid of something Owen was now taking off their hands for nothing. And he made a point of mentioning this figure to his facility's ownership group in the context of a broader cost review, which was how the arrangement that had started as a favor to a small farmer came to be quietly written into the mill's operating budget as a permanent cost reduction. Neither Carl nor Owen mentioned this to anyone in the valley, because there was no particular reason to, and the conversation would have required explaining things neither of them was yet ready to explain in the specific order they would need to be explained. Dean Ferris became aware, in the summer before the 1993 auction, that something was different about Owen Greer's operation, not because he'd asked any pointed questions, but because he'd happened to be driving past the farm on a Tuesday morning when a mill delivery truck was making a pickup and had slowed to look at the volume and stopped to count the animals in the nearest pen. The numbers suggested a growth rate he hadn't expected from waste-fed animals, and the visual condition of the animals was better than his memory of what a mill waste operation looked like. A memory that was based on his own rejection of Carl Dunn's approach years earlier rather than on any documented observation of what such an operation actually produced at maturity. He drove home with more questions than he'd expected to leave with, and spent a week at the Pork Association's research files looking for anything documented on the premium pork market performance of specialty-fed hogs, which was how he found, 3 weeks before the auction, a conference paper from a regional animal science program describing the fat profile and marbling characteristics of grain mash-fed pork in terms that were specific enough to be alarming if you were reading them while simultaneously remembering 5 years of comments you'd made at producer meetings. He called the association's board chair the following week to mention that he thought it might be worth putting a specialty feed research agenda item on the next meeting's program. The board chair said he'd add it to the list. The auction happened before the next meeting. The regional livestock auction in October of 1993 was a routine event that became, by the end of its first hour, the opposite of routine. Owen Greer's animals went through the floor in 2 batches, and both batches cleared at prices that the floor buyer for the valley's largest pork processing company described afterward as the clearest premium signal he had seen from a regional producer in his 12 years of buying for the company. Carol Estep was there, as she had asked to be, and she spent the auction recording the sale prices and the buyer notes in her research file, because the results were consistent enough with what she had projected from her pen observation 2 years earlier that the data was going to be useful to the conference paper she was already drafting. Dean Ferris was there because he attended every regional auction, and he stayed through Owen's batches rather than leaving when his own animals had cleared, and nobody who knew him well enough to read his expression would have described what was on it as anything other than the particular look of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not finding the answer he expected. The auctioneer did call the number twice on the second batch, not because he doubted the bid, but because the room response suggested not everyone had heard it the first time. Bert Colby, seated 2 rows behind Dean, leaned forward and asked the man beside him whether he'd heard the number right. He had. After the auction, in the parking lot, Dean Ferris walked over to Owen Greer and said, without preamble, that he would like to come out and see the operation when Owen had time, if Owen was willing. Owen told him he was welcome anytime. The Pork Association's specialty feed research agenda item eventually made it onto a meeting program in early 1994, with Carol Estep presenting the data she had compiled from Owen's operation and 2 other waste stream feeding cases she had begun documenting in the months since the auction. The presentation was the most attended program item the association had run in years, and the conversation that followed it was the most substantive the association's board had engaged in on any feeding topic in a decade, because the auction numbers had done something that 5 years of dismissal and 2 years of Dean Ferris's committee influence had not been able to do in reverse, which was make the room genuinely interested in a question it had previously decided was settled. Dean participated in the discussion that day rather than leading it, for the first time in anyone's memory, and his questions were the kind that a person asks when they are trying to understand something rather than confirm a conclusion they already hold. He drove out to Owen's operation the following month as he had said he would, walked the pens with Carol and Owen together, and spent an afternoon asking questions that would have been useful 5 years earlier and were still useful now for different reasons, the main difference being that the answers were no longer theoretical. Owen answered all of them without making Dean stand in the pen while he acknowledged what the previous 5 years had looked like from Owen's side of the fence, because making people relive the record of their own certainty was not what Owen had spent 5 years building toward, and it was not the kind of farmer he had any interest in being. The mill's waste stream was still coming every Tuesday. The pigs were still eating it. The next auction was 5 months away. The lesson Kellner Valley eventually settled into from Owen Greer's operation was one that made a certain category of farmer in the valley quietly uncomfortable, because it was not a lesson about ingenuity exactly, or even about risk-taking, but about the specific cost of dismissing something without running the numbers on it. Dean Ferris had rejected the mill waste as a feeding input because it didn't fit the certified protocol his operation was built around, and because it didn't fit the certified protocol, he had stopped looking at it, and because he had stopped looking at it, he had spent 5 years unaware that the animals eating it were developing a fat profile and flavor characteristic that the premium end of the market had been seeking and not finding at scale. Owen Greer had run the numbers because he had no certified protocol to protect and no reputation to defend and no margin wide enough to afford the luxury of not finding out what was actually in the material he was feeding his animals. The auction board in October of 1993 was not a surprise to anyone who had done what Carol Estep had done, which was walk the pens and read the research. It was a surprise to everyone who had done what Dean Ferris had done, which was decide the conclusion was obvious before looking at the evidence. Drive past Owen Greer's operation today, and the mill delivery truck is still making its Tuesday run, the relationship with Carl Dunn still a standing agreement. The notebook still being updated with the same records that Carol Estep photographed for her conference paper. The animals in the pens look like what they are, which is pigs eating mill waste in a barn that smells like fermentation and produces, at auction, prices that nobody in the valley calls a garbage farm anymore. The numbers saw to that. They had been seeing to it all along, from the moment Owen ran them on the first delivery, and the only difference between Owen's operation and every other operation in the valley that could have taken Carl Dunn's call was that Owen picked up the phone and asked what was actually in the material before deciding he already knew. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go, because it genuinely helps more people find it. Share it with someone who has ever turned something everyone else called garbage into something worth talking about. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one every week. And down in the comments, tell us about a time you found value in something everyone around you had already thrown away. We read every single one.